Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
You know, I want you to imagine you are standing in a crowded room. Like maybe it is a friend's wedding or a really busy coffee shop.
Or honestly, even just your own living room.
Yeah, exactly. Your own living room with your family.
Mm-hmm.
And physically, you are completely surrounded by people. Like the volume of human contact is objectively really high.
Right.
But creeping up the back of your neck is this strange, almost suffocating sensation of ambient disconnection.
Mm-hmm. That is such a specific feeling.
It really is. It is that haunting feeling of being utterly invisible while you are bathed in a spotlight.
Wow. Yeah.
Like friendships just thinning out into the ether with no dramatic ending at all.
Just fading away.
Right. Or conversations with someone you love abruptly turning into a battlefield over the absolute smallest friction. And just, the overwhelming exhaustion of public life.
Especially when you open a screen.
Oh, absolutely. You open your phone and you are instantly saturated with contact, but somehow completely starved of actual connection.
Well, it is the defining structural paradox of our era, really. Because we have engineered this reality where we are hyper-visible to one another. I mean, we are constantly transmitting data about our whereabouts, our opinions, our breakfasts.
Right. Everything is public.
Everything. And yet, the self-reported sensation across almost every demographic is that we are completely, systematically unseen.
Which brings us right into the heart of today's source material for this deep dive.
Yes.
We are looking at a really fascinating and honestly incredibly provocative 2026 diagnostic book by Professor R.J. Starr.
It is called Structural Failure: The Architecture of Human Disconnection.
That is the one. And before we go any further into this, I feel like we really need to set the boundaries for what this deep dive is and, more importantly, what it isn't.
That is a very necessary boundary to draw, actually, because Starr's work explicitly rejects the current cultural appetite for quick fixes.
Exactly. So if you are listening right now and hoping we're going to reveal some 10-step morning routine to cure your loneliness...
Or like a communication hack to immediately fix your marriage.
Right, yeah, you are definitely in the wrong place, because that is not what this text does.
No, not at all.
The mission here is to build what Starr calls structural literacy.
Right.
The goal is to fundamentally change how we perceive human behavior. Like instead of looking at a fractured relationship and diagnosing individual character flaws.
Labeling people as toxic or avoidant or narcissistic, which we do all the time.
Exactly. We do so much. But structural literacy trains us to see behavior as the highly predictable output of psychological systems.
Systems operating under specific, usually extreme conditions.
Right. And that shift from moral judgment to systemic analysis is just profound.
It really is. Because, we spend so much energy acting as amateur psychologists.
Oh, no, totally.
Diagnosing the people who hurt us as fundamentally broken entities. But structural literacy demands that we stop looking at the person as a static villain. And we start looking at the architecture of the system they are operating within and the immense pressures crushing down on that architecture.
So to make this real for you listening, I want you to think of a specific broken connection in your own life right now. Like, keep it right in the front of your mind as we go through this.
That is a great idea.
Maybe it is a best friend who completely ghosted you after years of closeness, and they left you with zero explanation.
Or maybe a partner who is physically sitting on the couch next to you every single night, but feels a million miles away.
Right. Or even think of that impossible, blood-boiling political argument you had with a neighbor where you both walked away absolutely convinced the other was living in a total delusion.
We all have one of those.
We really do. So keep that specific person and the pain of that specific fracture in your mind, because we are going to put it under an entirely new lens today.
And to build that lens, we have to start where Starr starts in the book, which is basically addressing the why now question.
Right. Like, why is this ambient disconnection happening at this exact moment in history?
Exactly. And why does it feel like an epidemic? Because society really doesn't lack explanations for this. We are drowning in explanations.
We really are. reading the book, it lays out these three massive dominant narratives we currently use to explain why everyone feels so isolated.
Right, starting with the technology explanation.
Yeah, we blame the algorithms. The whole idea is that social media has basically cannibalized authentic, messy human connection and replaced it with this shallow, curated performance.
Because the platforms are literally engineered to reward our outrage and penalize nuance.
Exactly. And then the second one is the political explanation.
Right, the idea that polarization has entirely shattered our shared epistemic reality.
Yeah, like the argument goes that we no longer just disagree on how to govern. We literally disagree on the basic verifiable facts of existence.
We live in fractured realities, which makes connection impossible across ideological lines.
Right. And then the third narrative is the economic explanation. Total precarity. When massive segments of the population are, working multiple gig economy jobs just to afford rent and groceries.
It destroys the basic physical and emotional bandwidth you need to maintain relationships.
Exactly. The local institutions like the community centers, the neighborhood associations, that whole infrastructure has just been hollowed out by economic stress.
Now, all three of those explanations capture something undeniably real. Like they are valid, empirically observable trends.
Yeah, nobody's denying the economy is tough or Twitter is angry.
Right. But Starr's central critique is that they are fundamentally incomplete.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Because they identify the contributing conditions of our disconnection, but they entirely miss the mechanism.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second here, though.
Go for it.
If the algorithms are actively designed to make us hate each other, to drive engagement, isn't the technology the mechanism? Like, it feels like the machine is directly causing the breakdown.
Well, it definitely feels that way. But think about it from an engineering perspective, right? The algorithm provides the stimulus, but it doesn't create the psychological vulnerability that it exploits. Starr argues that these standard explanations describe the environment, but they do not describe the actual architecture that the environment is acting upon.
Okay, yes. Reading this section of the text, I just kept coming back to the analogy of a leaky roof.
Oh, that is a perfect way to look at it.
Right. Like, blaming social media or economic stress for our relational collapse is like looking at a collapsed house and just blaming the rainstorm.
Exactly. Yes, the rain is real.
The rain is very real. The rain is heavy and totally unprecedented, but we know what the weather is doing. The actual diagnostic question we need to ask is, why was the roof built in such a way that it could not handle the water?
Right. Why is the house collapsing instead of just, getting wet?
Exactly.
That is precisely the distinction Starr is making. The rain is the condition, but the roof is the mechanism. So Starr's thesis is that the disconnection we are feeling is not fundamentally a technological failure or political failure, and it is certainly not a moral failure. It is a structural failure.
A structural failure?
Yes. The psychological systems that make up human minds haven't suddenly broken down. Human nature hasn't magically devolved in the last 20 years.
Which is strangely comforting, honestly.
Right. Our psychological systems are doing exactly what they evolved to do over hundreds of thousands of years. But they are operating in modern conditions that simply no longer support the human connection they were originally designed to produce.
So the system isn't broken, it's just radically misplaced.
Exactly.
So to understand how that works, we need to look at the blueprint of the house itself. Starr breaks down our psychological architecture into 4 interacting domains.
Right.
And I really want to avoid just listing these like a textbook because the way they interact is entirely dynamic.
It is very fluid, yeah.
So let's imagine a highly common scenario. You've had a brutal day at work, you walk in the front door, and your partner immediately asks, "Did you remember to take out the trash?"
Oh, I know that scenario well.
Right. So walk us through the 4 domains using that specific trigger.
Okay, that is a perfect scenario. So first domain is the mind. This is the interpretive engine.
Okay.
Its job is to make predictions, model the world, and basically decide what incoming data actually means.
Right.
So when your partner asks about the trash, the mind's job isn't just to hear the audio of the words. It is to interpret the intent behind them.
Like, is this a neutral logistical question, or is it a targeted accusation of laziness?
Exactly. And the interpretation it chooses instantly fires up the second domain, which is emotion.
Right, emotion.
Right. Emotion is the regulatory domain. It translates the mind's interpretation into physical urgency and motivation. It's essentially your physiological alarm system.
Okay, so if the mind interprets the trash question as an attack, the emotion domain literally dumps cortisol into your bloodstream.
Yes, exactly. It tells your nervous system whether to lean in, freeze, or prepare for combat.
Wow. And then we hit the third domain, which Starr calls identity.
Yes, the continuity domain.
Right.
Its entire evolutionary purpose is to maintain a coherent self-concept across time. It tells the story of who you are.
So, for instance, I am a hardworking provider who deserves respect.
Exactly, and it fights desperately to keep that narrative stable. So if the mind perceives the trash question as an implication that you are irresponsible, the identity domain registers that as an existential threat to its core narrative.
Wow. And finally, we have the fourth domain, which is meaning.
The organizing domain, right?
Yeah. This situates all these micro experiences into a broader framework of purpose. Like, it decides if this argument over the trash is just a minor blip in a loving marriage or evidence of a tragic overarching narrative that you are just doomed to be unappreciated forever.
Right. Now, here is where Starr's framework really flips our usual understanding of conflict completely on its head.
Yeah, this is the big pivot.
These four domains do not just boot up the moment your partner speaks. They are always running.
They are always on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Starr calls this the ambient state. Your ambient state, like the current alignment and stress level of your mind, emotion, identity, and meaning, has already determined what you are capable of perceiving long before the front door even opens.
This is huge because we almost always think a fight starts because of the trigger, right?
Right. We say, we are fighting because you asked about the trash in a passive-aggressive tone.
Exactly. But the structural lens tells us the fight was already primed by the ambient state.
Yes.
If your emotional domain is currently flooded from that brutal day at work, and your identity domain feels super insecure because maybe your boss criticized you, your mind domain has basically preloaded a defensive interpretation. The words were just the spark hitting a room already filled with gas.
Which leads right to the core diagnostic tool in Starr's entire framework.
Right.
The distinction between a psychological system organized around coherence versus a system organized around rigidity.
Oh, man. I found this distinction so clarifying.
It really is.
Because both coherence and rigidity are strategies for survival, right? But they operate completely differently under pressure.
Exactly.
So how does a coherent system behave?
Well, a coherent system updates flexibly. It has the actual capacity to absorb disruption.
Okay.
So when new uncomfortable information arrives, say, your partner points out that you actually have been neglecting household chores lately, a coherent system says, okay, this is uncomfortable, it really stings my pride, but I need to revise my internal models to accommodate this reality.
It integrates discomfort to maintain a broader, more accurate connection to the real world.
Precisely.
But when a system is exhausted or threatened or just overstressed, it defaults to the rigid state.
Exactly. A rigid system maintains the illusion of stability through a completely opposite mechanism.
Right.
Instead of updating flexibly, it holds itself together by narrowing its operating range. It actively forecloses.
Yeah.
It blocks out new inputs that would require it to adapt. Instead of integrating discomfort, a rigid system just manages it.
Usually by lashing out, withdrawing, or just denying the reality of the threat entirely.
Right.
Starr uses the example of a sleep-deprived person in the book, which really grounded this for me.
Oh, the barista example.
Yeah. If you haven't slept in 48 hours and you aggressively snap at a barista for getting your coffee order wrong, it's not because your true, dark, toxic personality is finally being revealed.
Oh.
It's because your structural architecture is operating under severe physiological pressure. Like, it literally lacks the energetic resources to be coherent.
It has narrowed its capacity to process nuance.
Exactly. You've become temporarily rigid.
And this is where structural literacy becomes deeply empathetic, even while remaining super analytical. Because if we scale up that barista example to the profound fractures we see today, like the silent, bitter contempt in a marriage, or the sudden, inexplicable withdrawal of a lifelong friend.
Or the absolute venom we see online every day.
Exactly. These are not inherent moral failings of the people involved. They are expressions of rigidity under pressure. The system is overwhelmed by the modern environment, so it forecloses. It literally shuts down the capacity for connection in a desperate bid to protect the continuity of the self.
But the absolute tragedy here is that we almost never see it that way in the moment, do we?
Rarely.
When someone lashes out at us, we don't think, oh, wow, their system is temporarily rigid due to ambient pressure.
No, we take it personally.
We take it so personally. Which brings us to a concept in the text that I am absolutely obsessed with.
Oh, parochial attribution.
Yes. It explains exactly how and why we misread each other so consistently.
It is an incredibly precise term for a universal, completely devastating human flaw.
So to understand it, Starr points out that we all navigate the world through an invisible framework. Like, we all have a map in our heads of how reality works.
Right.
The map dictates what is good, what is bad, what is polite, what is just common sense.
Mm-hmm.
But the cruel trick the brain plays on us is that this framework doesn't feel like a map.
No, it doesn't feel like a subjective interpretation at all.
Exactly. It just feels like objective, undeniable reality.
And the mechanism of parochial attribution kicks in the exact moment your map encounters someone operating on a completely different map.
Right.
Because we assume our map is objective reality, our default structural tendency is to interpret other people's behavior through our local framework.
Through our map.
Exactly. When someone acts in a way that makes no sense on our map, we do not pause and deduce, they must be navigating via a different set of psychological coordinates.
No way. We assume they're broken.
Or stupid, or acting in bad faith.
Right. If my map says that caring about someone means texting them back within 10 minutes, and your map says that caring about someone means giving them space when they are stressed, our maps are going to totally collide.
Oh, big time.
When you don't text me back, my parochial attribution dictates that you're actively choosing to disrespect me.
And the most vital point Starr makes about this dynamic is the sincerity of the misreading.
It's heart-wrenching, honestly.
It really is. Because we are maliciously trying to misunderstand people. We genuinely, sincerely believe that our local explanation of their behavior is the objective truth.
Yeah.
You are not trying to be paranoid or demanding.
Yeah.
Your structural architecture literally cannot process their silence as anything other than an attack because your map has no legend for silence equals affection.
And this structural sincerity is exactly why arguments fail so spectacularly. Like, think about the last time you tried to defend yourself when someone was misreading you.
It is exhausting.
When you challenge someone's parochial attribution, when you tell them, no, you are completely misreading my intentions, I wasn't ignoring you, I was just overwhelmed, that challenge is not processed neutrally by their mind.
Because it can't be. The challenge is fed directly into their existing rigid framework.
Right.
And a rigid framework's primary directive is to protect itself from collapse. So it interprets your alternative explanation as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
It usually takes your protest and uses it as further confirmation of its own rightness.
Like, the fact that you are arguing with me and making excuses just proves how defensive and guilty you are?
Precisely. The system cannot afford to integrate your alternative explanation, because doing so would require it to admit that its map of reality is flawed.
Wow.
Updating a core map costs immense psychological energy and risks a momentary identity collapse. It is far more structurally economical to reject your reality and double down on the original misdiagnosis.
I want you to think of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this. Think about a time you were completely systematically misread by someone you deeply cared about.
It is awful.
It is a uniquely isolating pain. You aren't just misunderstood, you are actively reduced. You are flattened into this simplified two-dimensional character in someone else's identity-protecting narrative.
Right.
They have written a script where they are the objective observer and you are the irrational, malicious actor. And literally nothing you say, no evidence you present can alter their script.
Because your actual nuanced complexity is structurally invisible to them in that rigid state. Yeah. If they were to truly acknowledge your complexity, the simple protective narrative they've built would shatter.
Right.
And this failure of visibility leads us directly into one of the most painful and common manifestations of this dynamic in modern life. The way connections physically break.
We are talking about ghosting here.
The modern architecture of exit.
Yeah. Society has a very clear, very loud moral verdict on ghosting. We basically treat it as the ultimate cowardice.
Absolutely.
It is framed entirely as a moral failing. Like, the cultural consensus is that a person who ghosts you is fundamentally selfish, lacks empathy, and possesses no basic human decency.
But the structural lens strips away all that moralizing and just looks at the mechanics.
Right.
Starr argues that ghosting is not primarily a failure of character or morality. It is a failure of what he terms exit capacity.
Exit capacity. That concept completely shifted how I view my own past breakups and faded friendships. Yeah. Because to grasp it, we have to look at the alternative. Like, what does explicit, healthy closure actually demand from a person's psychological architecture? If I sit you down to tell you I no longer want to be friends, what is my system required to do?
Well, explicit closure is structurally exhausting. It requires an immense amount of cognitive and emotional load-bearing.
Right.
To look someone in the eye, even virtually, and sever a connection requires several domains to fire simultaneously and perfectly. First, you have to tolerate the other person's pain and your own guilt without your emotion domain triggering a full fight-or-flight retreat.
Okay.
Second, your identity domain has to be strong enough to integrate the identity cost of being the bad guy in their story.
Which is so hard. You have to accept that you are causing harm.
Exactly. And third, your mind domain has to maintain regulatory stability while the other person might be crying, yelling, or attempting to negotiate.
It is a massive, highly coordinated stress test on the architecture.
It really is. And ghosting occurs when a person's structural resources simply cannot meet the demands of that situation.
Their exit capacity has basically dropped to zero.
Exactly. So they deploy withdrawal not out of calculated malice, but as an emergency regulatory maneuver.
Wow.
They shut down the connection unilaterally to prevent their own system from experiencing a total emotional and identity collapse. It is, as Starr says, an exit without architecture.
I mean, I understand the mechanism, but I really have to push back here on behalf of anyone who has ever been ghosted.
That is fair.
It just feels incredibly cruel. Even if it is an emergency regulatory maneuver for the ghoster, the collateral damage is devastating. It feels like they just dumped all of their anxiety right onto the other person.
And your pushback is exactly aligned with Starr's analysis, actually.
Really?
Yes, he doesn't excuse the behavior at all. He just mapped the consequences.
Right.
He describes ghosting as a transfer of burden.
Okay, that makes sense.
By vanishing, the ghoster achieves a highly efficient psychological economy. They get to freeze the relationship in their mind at its last, uncontested, peaceful moment.
And they never have to see themselves as the villain.
Exactly. But the cost of that economy is entirely borne by the person who gets ghosted, who is left holding what cognitive psychology calls an open loop.
Ugh, the open loop is a brutal state of existence.
It is torture.
And this is where I think the structural account offers a profound gift, honestly, because it completely removes the shame from the victim.
Yes.
If you have ever been ghosted, you know the exact drill. You find yourself obsessing over old texts, replaying the last conversation in your head 1,000 times, constantly scanning their social media for any clues. And society, and often your own friends, tells you that you need to just let it go, that you are being needy or obsessive or even unhinged.
But the structural lens says you are none of those things. Starr is incredibly clear on this, that obsessing is not a sign of weakness or neediness.
Right.
It is your cognitive predictive system, your mind domain, doing exactly what it evolved to do to keep you safe.
Because your brain is a prediction machine.
Exactly. It predicted a sequence. Connection, conversation, continuation. That sequence was violently broken without a single signal or warning.
Right.
So the brain stays locked in high alert scanning mode, desperately trying to resolve the prediction error. It is literally searching the environment for a closure marker that was never provided.
And because no external explanation is provided by the ghoster, the victim's mind runs straight into what Starr calls the proportionality problem.
Yes.
Because in the absence of an answer, the human mind cannot just tolerate a vacuum. It is forced to generate its own explanation. And the tragedy of human psychology dictates that we almost always organize that manufactured explanation right around the self.
We assume causality.
Yeah.
We assume we are the variable that caused the failure.
Yes. The brain does this brutal calculus. It says the punishment was severe, utter, silent abandonment. Therefore, the crime I committed must have been equally severe.
Right.
We assume that a departure of that magnitude must mean we are fundamentally inadequate, we must be unlovable, we must have done something monstrously wrong that we can't even remember.
But the structural truth is that their sudden departure is a measurement of their exit capacity, not a verdict on your worth.
That is such a relieving way to look at it.
It is.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as we look at the broader picture of modern relationships, this lack of exit capacity has mutated.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it has bled into a newer phenomenon driven by our digital environment. Because we don't just ghost anymore, we orbit.
Orbiting. It might be the absolute bane of modern dating and friendship.
It really is.
For anyone unfamiliar with the term, orbiting is when someone withdraws from active reciprocal engagement with you. Like they don't text you back, they cancel plans, they refuse to actually communicate, but they continue to watch every single one of your digital stories. They like your posts. They hover constantly in your digital periphery like a ghost haunting a house.
Starr defines this structurally as non-reciprocal visibility. And we have to pause and realize that this is a historically unprecedented condition for the human brain.
Right, because for the entire evolutionary history of our species, if you were paying attention to someone, you were in physical proximity to them.
Exactly, which meant you were engaged with them, or at least vulnerable to them.
Mm-hmm.
But digital platforms have, for the first time, completely decoupled proximity from engagement. Now, observation is highly legible, like you have an exact list of who viewed your story, but communication and accountability are completely, entirely stripped away.
So what does this environment actually do to the psychological architecture of the two people involved?
Well, Starr argues that this ambiguity creates a terrifyingly stable equilibrium.
Okay.
For the orbiter, it is the perfect structural setup. It preserves optionality without any of the friction of accountability.
So they get to keep a foot in the door, they get to consume the narrative of your life without having to integrate the heavy identity cost of being the person who left.
Exactly. But for the orbited person, it is a structural nightmare. It creates a continuous, unresolvable, interpretive burden.
Right. Every single time that little profile picture pops up in the viewer list, the predictive system, that open loop we just discussed, is violently reactivated.
Over and over again.
Does this mean they care? Are they regretting their decision? Are they coming back? Why are they watching me?
The signal of attention is real and measurable. But the meaning of that attention is intentionally, cruelly withheld.
And this ties into a massive shift in how we value ourselves, doesn't it? Because digital attention has become quantified. We have follower counts. We have story view metrics. Attention is a literal numerical currency now.
Yes.
And Starr points out that this creates external anchoring. Our identity domain, that part of us that needs to know we are a coherent, valued self, starts requiring continuous metric confirmation to feel secure.
It outsources its stability to the platform.
Exactly. And this just pours high-octane gasoline on the structural architecture of jealousy.
It hyper-triggers our deepest insecurities. I mean, think about the evolutionary function of jealousy. It is essentially a threat detection system designed for relational security. In the ancestral environment, to trigger jealousy, you had to physically observe your partner, dedicating prolonged, focused, high-cost attention to someone else. It required time and proximity. But today, digital attention is incredibly cheap to distribute. A like takes a fraction of a second. A view is passive. But our ancient psychological architecture doesn't know what an algorithm is.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't.
So it still perceives the distribution of that cheap attention as a survival-level threat to relational security.
We are tracking a cheap, completely degraded currency digital likes with a survival-level threat detection system.
Exactly.
It is no wonder everyone feels constantly, ambiently insecure. We are reacting to microstimuli as if they are life-or-death abandonments.
Which brings Starr to a really profound summary of this specific, modern flavor of loneliness. He calls it the loneliness of the unclose connection.
That is a great phrase.
He argues it is actually far more psychologically taxing than total absence, because when someone is fully, completely gone, the emotional domain eventually accepts the loss, initiates the grieving process, and allows the system to adapt to a new reality.
But when someone is peripherally present, perpetually orbiting you, that faint digital heartbeat actively prevents the grieving process from closing.
You are trapped indefinitely in the waiting room of your own relationship.
It is agonizing.
It really is.
But one of the most powerful pivots in Starr's book is that he absolutely refuses to just blame the digital world, like the screens are just one environment. He actually transitions us away from the glow of the phone and right into the quiet of the living room.
That's the analog world.
Because the most consequential structural failures don't just happen on social media platforms. They happen quietly, imperceptibly over decades, inside long-term marriages, families, and completely analog friendships.
He calls this the quiet collapse, and it is perhaps the most sobering diagnostic work in the entire text.
Oh, without a doubt.
Starr makes a critical, razor-sharp distinction here between the experience of being heard and the experience of being seen.
I really want to spend some time on this distinction, because colloquially, we use them interchangeably all the time, but structurally they are miles apart. So what is the actual mechanical difference?
Okay, so being heard is fundamentally transactional. It is the processing of audio data.
Okay.
A partner might hear the logistical words you were saying, like, I'm really stressed about this project at work, or can you make sure to pick up the kids on time today?
Right.
Their mind domain processes the information, and maybe they even execute the task. But they can do all of that while failing entirely to provide recognition.
Recognition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Recognition is not transactional, it is existential. It is the palpable feeling that your actual complex, evolving texture as a human being is being acknowledged, engaged with, and integrated by the other person.
I found the section terrifying to read, honestly, precisely because it describes something so mundane and normal.
It is very common.
Starr outlines how, over time, in a long-term relationship, people simply stop updating their internal map of their partner.
Yes.
Like when you first meet, your mind domain is working overtime to create a model of who this person is. It is exciting, it is highly coherent, but by year 10, it takes energy to keep observing them.
It is structurally expensive.
Exactly. So to save cognitive energy, you literally stop interacting with the actual breathing human in front of you. You start interacting with the established model of them that you built a decade ago.
Right. You shift from providing genuine recognition to merely managing an established dynamic efficiently.
It is the ultimate quiet expression of structural rigidity.
It really is.
Yeah.
It is highly efficient for the brain, yes, but it is deeply suffocatingly isolating for the relationship.
You end up living with someone who knows every single granular detail about your schedule, your food allergies, your morning habits, but knows absolutely nothing about who you are becoming.
Or what you fear now, or how your inner life is shifted.
Right. And you try to point it out and they say, what do you mean? I do the dishes, I pick up the kids, I listen to you vent about work.
They are pointing to the transactions of being heard.
While you were literally starving from the lack of being seen.
Exactly. But here is where Starr zooms out and connects this living room tragedy to the broader societal collapse. Because we have to ask, why do we demand so much recognition from our romantic partners in the first place?
Right. Why is all the pressure on them?
Because of the deficit of collective recognition. This is a crucial structural insight.
Okay, break that down.
Well, 50 or 60 years ago, an individual's identity structure was held up by multiple pillars. You might have been recognized and seen by your church congregation, your local labor union, your bowling league, your extended neighborhood association.
Right. Your identity as a reliable or funny or hardworking person was reflected back to you by dozens of different eyes in different contexts.
Exactly. But as those civic institutions have steadily vanished, hollowed out by the economic precarity and cultural shifts we discussed earlier, we have lost those external mirrors.
So what do? We take all of that structural weight and we place an impossible demand right on our romantic partners.
Yes. We are essentially asking one single person lying in bed next to us to be our sole source of identity reflection.
We're asking them to do the structural load-bearing work that an entire village, an entire community used to do.
And when they inevitably fail, because absolutely no single human architecture is designed to bear that much load indefinitely.
We don't see it as a structural failure.
No, we experience it as a catastrophic personal rejection. We think, my marriage is failing, rather than realizing the structural demands on modern marriage are mathematically impossible to meet.
That is a crushing realization, but strangely liberating at the same time.
If my partner can't be my entire universe, maybe that's not a flaw in my partner.
But this phenomenon of identity load-bearing scales up. Like, if this is how our structures buckle in the privacy of our homes, what happens when they fail in the public square?
Oh, this is where it gets really intense.
How does this psychological architecture scale up to explain the absolute toxicity of our current political reality? Because we are moving from the domestic level to the societal level here.
And here is where we must be incredibly precise, because we are talking about how beliefs shift from being simply held opinions to becoming load-bearing features of a person's identity.
Yes, and let's weave in a crucial point Starr makes here, because the data is unequivocal on this. The structural dynamic we're about to describe applies universally.
Universally.
The psychological architecture of coherence, maintenance, and defensive foreclosure does not care about the content of your political belief.
Not at all.
It operates the exact same way whether you are on the far left or the far right. We explicitly need to state that.
Precisely. It is a universal, nonpartisan mechanism. We all harbor this overwhelming conviction that our side is clear-eyed, rational, and driven by facts, while their side is brainwashed, emotional, and driven by fear.
Right. But Starr's analysis shows that the feeling of absolute clarity is not proof of your side's superiority. That feeling of unquestionable rightness is itself a predictable mathematical output of a closed, rigid psychological system that has successfully blocked out threatening information.
Exactly. So how does this structural rigidity physically manifest when we talk about politics? Starr uses the concept of regression.
But he redefines it right in a way that is incredibly useful.
He does. Because when we normally hear the word regression, we think of an adult throwing a childish temper tantrum. We think of a return to infancy.
Right, a behavioral regression.
But structurally, regression is defined as the suppression of higher-order cognitive function.
Okay, what does that look like?
It is the sudden loss of the ability to tolerate ambiguity. It is the inability to hold two competing ideas in your mind simultaneously. It is the complete collapse of reflective thought.
Wow.
Under conditions of perceived identity threat, like someone challenging a political belief that you have tied your entire self-worth to, the system simply powers down those expensive, higher-order cognitive functions.
It routes all available energy to pure defense.
Exactly.
You mentioned asymmetric evidence processing earlier in the notes, and I think this is exactly where that fits in.
Yes.
Can you explain how the regressed mind handles incoming information? Because it doesn't just shut down, right? It becomes highly selective.
Asymmetric evidence processing is exactly what it sounds like. When your system is rigid, your brain acts like a highly motivated defense lawyer for ideas it already agrees with.
And a ruthless, impossible-to-please prosecutor for ideas that challenge it.
Exactly. If you see a news story that confirms your political bias, your brain accepts it instantly, requiring zero proof. It feels intuitively true.
But if you see a news story that challenges your worldview, your brain suddenly demands peer-reviewed perfection.
Right. It finds microscopic flaws and dismisses the entire premise. The processing of evidence is structurally rigged to protect the identity.
And the cost of this rigged system is catastrophic for public discourse. Because under these conditions of identity threat, the goal of a conversation or a debate is no longer to achieve understanding.
Understanding is a luxury of a coherent system.
Exactly. The goal of the interaction is entirely replaced by the performance of winning.
Because the stakes have fundamentally changed. If a belief is just a belief, say, a preference for a certain tax policy, you can lose an argument, realize you were wrong, and learn something. The map updates.
But if a belief has been fused to your identity domain, if your belief about a policy is deeply tied to your sense of being a good, moral person, losing the argument isn't just losing a debate.
No, losing the argument triggers identity collapse. The system literally cannot afford to lose.
So it will deploy every weapon at its disposal. Parochial attribution, contempt, screaming, cognitive distortion, to ensure it survives the encounter intact.
It explains so much about the modern media landscape. When you watch two highly educated people screaming past each other on a cable news panel, it's deeply depressing until you apply the structural lens.
You realize you aren't actually watching an exchange of ideas.
Ideas aren't even in the room.
You are watching two rigid psychological architectures desperately defending themselves from structural collapse. They are performing for their respective in-groups to secure their ambient state. It's an exercise in survival, not intellect.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of Starr's work, and really the core of our discussion today. What is the value of knowing all of this?
Right. If the system is rigged, if the environment is hostile to connection, and if our brains are constantly misreading reality to protect themselves, what do we actually do with this diagnostic information?
Well, the value is the gift of structural literacy itself. As we established at the very beginning of this deep dive, Starr's work doesn't offer a magic bullet.
No, it doesn't offer a 10-step plan to fix society, save your marriage, or heal the political divide.
What it offers is accuracy.
And in a landscape completely saturated with false explanations, moral panic, and constant outrage, accuracy is a profound, stabilizing relief.
It really is.
I want you to think about the broken connection I asked you to hold in your mind at the start of this hour. Why does structural literacy matter to you, specifically regarding that fracture?
It matters because when you possess this lens, the world stops feeling quite so personally malicious.
Exactly. A ghosting isn't a dark verdict on your unlovable soul. It's a measurable failure of someone else's exit capacity.
Right. An impossible, screaming political argument with your uncle isn't evidence that he is fundamentally, irredeemably evil. It's two rigid frameworks colliding under extreme ambient pressure, desperate to prevent identity collapse.
And the quiet, terrifying distance in your long-term relationship isn't necessarily a failure of love. It might just be an accumulation of unupdated models and the unfair weight of a collapsed civic society pressing right down on your living room.
Structural literacy allows you to look at the wreckage of modern connection and say, the system is functioning exactly as it was built to function, given the extreme, unprecedented conditions it is currently facing.
Now, to be clear, this doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility for their actions. Harm is still harm.
Absolutely.
But it completely changes the point of intervention. You stop trying to fix the person and you start looking at the environment and the capacity.
It removes the extra agonizing layer of moral self-indictment.
Yes. It replaces the endless, spinning anger with a sober, accurate view of human mechanics. It literally lets you step off the battlefield.
That is the real gift of this work.
So I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to turn over in your mind long after this deep dive ends.
Okay.
We spent this time establishing that our modern environment, like the digital algorithms, the economic stress, the political isolation, is almost perfectly designed to trigger our defensive architecture and suppress our capacity for genuine connection. So, what happens to the people who choose to intentionally step out of that environment? Can we build local architectures of connection in our own living rooms and our own analog friendships that actively resist the ambient disconnection of the world outside?
This is a great question.
If the house is collapsing because the roof wasn't built for this much rain, can we stop yelling at the storm and simply start building a better roof together?
Wow.
Think about the invisible map you are using today. And the next time you feel that flash of anger or isolation, just ask yourself, whose territory are you actually trying to navigate?
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.